Broadcast is now starting. All attend
series. And for today, we're going to be talking about Zero Trust. My name is Frank Urena. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group, and joining me is my colleague, Mark Riley, also a principal architect. And for those not familiar with Oxford, Oxford Computer Group is a consulting and systems integrator working with Microsoft many years, having done a lot of projects around identity and access management and governance. Today, again, we're going to be specifically talking about zero trust security architectures and how these apply in your identity projects and initiatives, and what Microsoft's approach is to zero trust. And so to get a feel for the audience, we're going to just put up a poll question. And that question is, how familiar are you with zero trust? So I'm just launching that now. If you could just give us an answer so we know how fast or how slow we can proceed. Just give a few more seconds. Still have people joining us. Okay, thanks for giving us an indication. Majority are somewhat familiar, so this is going to be good. It's, hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll go from knowing a little to knowing a lot more. And I don't think you're going to be made an expert after following this webinar, but certainly this could get you started with understanding the concepts involved and some of the technologies involved and how to start implementation in your organization. So as we titled our webinar, our deck here, Zero Trust, it's all about identity, and even mom has the MFA. That was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but basically saying that in today's climate with security, no one is exempt from having to provide stepped up or stronger authentication methods to access information that's important to them. So our agenda, we're going to discuss what is zero trust, how it differs from the traditional security model of the past that is still, of course, in wide use today, which is why we're talking about this, what enabling zero trust looks like and how to understand your risk, how identity plays a central role in zero trust and how to create strong user and device identities. And then, since we are Microsoft partners primarily, we are going to talk about how Microsoft, through their security stack, is approaching zero trust, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So let's get started with what is zero trust. Well, first off, and I'm going to cover what it's not, which is the last bullet point on this slide. It's not a product or a service, and it's not tied to any one vendor. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Citrix, Cisco, name the vendors out there that have some measure of security or are interested in either network security, identity security, application security, don't have a lock on zero trust. It's more of a security framework. So it refers to that security framework, and the principles of that framework basically say that nothing should be trusted, whether those entities, and that's users, devices, and even networks, are outside of the perimeter, the traditional perimeter that's been secured with traditional firewalls for as long as we can remember, or whether they're inside the perimeter as well, trying to move away from this concept, this idea that just because you have good firewalls, good proxies, good application appliances that can detect anomalies and can detect breaches, that everything on the inside of your network is great and verified and should be trusted at all times. And it's based on this idea that organizations need to proactively control all interactions between people, data, information system, and their information system in order to reduce their security risk to an acceptable level. Zero trust can be tailored to your infrastructure and business requirements. There is some room on how zero trust can be implemented, and again, different vendors take slightly different approaches, but you'll see that they all follow the same guiding principles. It's just perhaps a difference, some nuance into how it's implemented. Zero trust is less about technology and devices such as, or appliances such as, firewalls and application delivery controllers and the like. And it's really more about people and, of course, the identities or credentials that those people are using to access their resources, company resources. And zero trust means that you never trust, but you always verify. Now, that never trust is just to simplify what zero trust is. Obviously, there is some trusting involved here. It's not that we don't trust anything, otherwise people would not be productive. They would not be able to get to their resources. But it just means really that that verification process on their authentication and their authorization to those applications is a continuous process. It's not just a kind of fire and forget it type of approach. This concept of zero trust is not new. To those of you, since 90%, on the poll question said you know a little bit about it. So you may have heard the term more recently in the past couple years, been thrown around a bit more. But it actually dates all the way back, at least as a concept, using zero trust networking to 2010, when a researcher at Forrester came up with the term. But you could even say that going back to 2004, that with network access control architectures, that was sort of the beginnings of zero trust, where you do not automatically trust a device as soon as it connected to your network and received an IP address from your DHCP infrastructure. First, it had to go through some gates in order to verify that it was safe, that it had appropriate anti-malware software on it, that perhaps it was a managed device, that it belonged to the right resource groups, etc. But from there, that started to evolve. Again, Forrester coins that term in 2010 of zero trust. In 2014, Microsoft is really pushing the message around assuming breach, with the old adage of the two types of companies that exist: those that have been breached and those that don't know it yet. Google in 2014 also publishes their Beyond Core infrastructure and how they went about implementing a zero trust architecture at Google. Microsoft then releases conditional access, what other, like Google, call contextual access, but it's essentially the same thing. And then we now moving towards this new strategy of passwordless initiatives to get rid of passwords, which has been initiative been going on for a while, but really it's stepped up now around the zero trust messaging. And even newer concepts around continuous access evaluation protocol and what they're doing there around tokens, access tokens, refresh tokens that are issued by identity providers in order to continually verify users' access to resources. Now, it's been a slow mainstream adoption. Of course, a lot has been spent on network infrastructure. And so it's slow to move away from that investment and towards the zero trust model, which really is putting the control at the user and the device side of things, but that makes sense to do that because with mobile and cloud applications, that's really where all the data has gone. It's really not behind the corporate firewall anymore. And then also with identity, the way identities are managed, that's also been a process to get organizations to change the way they're doing that. So, you're not going to see organizations that have adopted, for instance, the entire Google Beyond Core success. That's rarely replicated, but there are, of course, components that can be implemented. So again, this is just sort of to emphasize, these guiding principles. We want to make sure when we talk about zero trust, we're talking about verifying explicitly. We're always authenticating and verifying authentication and authorization based on all the available data points that we have to us. That's user identity, their location, the device's health, data classification, risk, and other anomalies like behavioral analytics that can be part of the signaling. It's also an old concept, but again, it fits into the zero trust security architecture of using least privilege access. Some have referred to it as JIT and JIA, or just in time and just enough administration. But privilege identity management, privilege access management are also part of that, where there doesn't exist any one user account that has a privileged role 100% of the time. It's granted through a privilege escalation process and verified and audited. And then again, going back to that previous statement about assuming breach, is just assuming that your network as it exists today already has an advanced persistent threat existing in it. It's been breached. Most attacks that have been discovered lie in wait, on average 206 days. So really the assumption has to be that your network has already been compromised. So zero trust helps with that, in that security posture. So why are we having a zero trust conversation? Well, it's because we're always trying to fight the bad guys. It's a sort of never-ending arms race with the advanced persistent threats getting more sophisticated. Of course, IT security can be very complex in this mobile-first, cloud-first world. There's many devices, users, applications, connections. And again, those applications are beyond the corporate perimeter at this point. They exist in the cloud across multiple cloud service providers. And that old trusted network security strategy just doesn't work anymore. Again, you have assets continuously leaving the network, introduce things like BYOD, work from home, which we're all experiencing at this time, mobile and SaaS application, and you can see why it's important now to evolve the IT security tactics as well to match up with the attacks out there, because those attacks have shifted and they're exploiting trust. Most attacks now, while there's still, of course, a large instance of brute force attacks or password spray or credential stuffing, because passwords continue to be used and human beings are just really bad at creating passwords that are hard for computers to guess. It's changing now. There's to the point where users are giving away their credentials to attackers through phishing attempts, spear phishing attempts, social media, where attackers can just find information on people that are the good targets to go after. And this, of course, leaves security teams overwhelmed with all the signals that they're receiving, all the alerts, not knowing exactly what to chase down. So there has to be a change in how we approach security, and zero trust is one of those ways. The access control strategy around zero trust really is kind of three pillars. It's about the signal, what you're receiving into the environment, and that goes for the device and for the user. So it's the device management, the threat detection on the device. For user risk, it's stepped up authentication using multi-factor or two-factor. It's behavioral analytics. Again, it's identity protection as well. And then central to all that is the decision control engine or access control engine. And that's where all the signals go to get evaluated and make a determination as to whether the user should be should be asked to re-authenticate through a process like multi-factor authentication, or whether or not they are still authorized for that application. For instance, if they've been their account has been disabled due to a termination, and they no longer should have access. That all has to flow through a single control plane or decision policy engine that can make that intelligent decision. And then there's the enforcement, right? What are the tools that are being used to enforce those policies that determine when users have access to what do they have access to, because that could change minute by minute. So you have to have good enforcement tools on the other end once those decisions have been made by the access control engine. So we talk about zero trust initiatives, strategic initiatives, and it starts with the identity architecture. It's important to establish an identity perimeter, and that can be done with conditional access. Conditional access is something that Microsoft uses as a term, but again, other vendors use similar terms. I mentioned Google uses contextual access in their product set in the Google Cloud, but it's essentially that the idea of giving users access based on conditions that are being met, or blocking users access based on those same conditions that are being met or not met. We also talk about a SOC modernization. So your security operations centers, need to shift their tooling to endpoint detection and response, to identity, leveraging AI, and of course the application layers. Secure administration, so we talk about privileged identity management or privileged access management for administrators, making sure that admins are securely accessing back-end systems, that they're using privileged accounts only, and those privileged accounts have to go through various gates in order to elevate their roles into a privileged role. Resource modernization is part of this as well, so that discusses talking or enabling legacy applications for zero trust through the use of access gateways and proxies. And then there's, of course, the network transformation, which is really where zero trust started, talking about zero trust networking. More advanced firewalls, proxies, micro-segmentation that some of the vendors like Palo Alto Networks and Cisco and others can provide. And some recommendations for implementing zero trust in the environment is you want to evaluate how different vendors fit into the zero trust initiative. So really look at those vendors that you're using today or plan to use and see are their products designed for zero trust. And you have a bullet point there, identify your protect surface. That's a term coined by Palo Alto Networks. And I liked it because it really helps to narrow the focus a bit. We talk about the attack surface a lot, but the attack surface is one of those things that it's hard to know. There are so many devices, and now with IoT in the mix, there are so many potential vectors for attackers. It's really, the attack surface has become somewhat unknowable to a certain degree. You can't really cover all your tracks. However, as Palo Alto argues in a white paper, you can know your protect surface, and that protect surface is basically the crown jewels, the things that you really want to protect in the environment, and that is a more reachable goal to understand what your protect surface is and how you can identify it, quantify it, because once you can do that, then you know how to build your zero trust initiative around that to protect those assets. Another recommendation is to tailor it to fit your business requirements and your existing infrastructure. Again, not everyone is going to go out there and just throw away everything that they have today. There are a lot of legacy systems still in place. They may not fit in just yet, but there are things you can do starting today, especially around identity with many of the products that are available. to help get you started on your zero trust journey. Conduct a gap analysis and develop a roadmap. Again, so that part of that gap analysis is knowing where your missing links are, knowing where your weaknesses are, and how you can shore those up, and then begin by implementing that roadmap. Now, before we move to the next issue, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mark. Our other poll question is here. Have you adopted a zero trust security model for your organization? If we can just get a few responses for that. Try to get above the 50% threshold here. All right, so got a good number of responses. About 48% responded that you're partially down the path, and 21% saying not yet, but planning on it. So you can see that it's really something a lot of organizations are doing. But let me hand over to colleague Mark, and he's going to talk to us about how zero trust differs from the traditional security model. So let me just give him control here. Mark.
Thank you, Frank.
Yep.
Good introduction. And yeah, as Frank said, Mark Riley, I'm an architect with Oxford Computer Group. We're going to talk a little bit more about traditional security model, how that interacts and differs from what we're talking about with zero trust. So let's make sure I can move the slides. So classic security model, we've all seen this, right? The perimeter walls and the moat. I only recently understood what the moats were for. They don't have alligators in them, I can tell you that. Another way of looking at perimeter security instead of the walls and the moat is this Cadbury cream egg with the crunchy exterior and the gooey interior, which is what most of those attackers are after, the gooey good bits inside, right? So in the traditional security model, we had sometimes an employee would connect from the internet. In the DMZ, they'd authenticate to a VPN, probably either a list of users on that VPN, or maybe it was in the domain that they were authenticating against. Then they transitioned through another firewall to that trusted location, the private service for that. An untrusted client might, however, connect through a load balancer, right, a web front end, be directed to one of many app servers, and then those app servers would act on behalf of that user to retrieve data from a protected content server. All of that requiring a direct line in, all of the support required for IT to manage all of these services, protect them from any attack, and be aware of any changes to them. This model was often used, as Frank said, because people inside the network, if you were in the network already beyond that VPN in the trusted network, you would just be granted access to that private service, and there'd be no other requirement other than perhaps your normal logon and password, or maybe not even that in some cases. As we move to cloud services, as we move to zero trust, we start making use of a different control plane. Instead of gating access by a VPN, we gate access by the user and the device and perhaps the location. But all of these various signals, whatever they are, go into our control plane, and the remote employee is then authenticated by that control plane and heads off to the service, whether that's a SaaS service, a secure gateway to get back inside on premises for legacy services, or a vendor service. And an untrusted client, while using the same path through a load balancer, app server, and PCI server, is not authenticated by those devices. The control plane authenticates them. So we have this central location with a single identity for the user that allows us to trust that user's identity right? We do have things that we trust that user's identity to access resources in various ways. Now, implementing or enabling zero trust, as Frank said, and as Bill Mann of Centrify says, not just technologies, process and mindset. So zero trust requires that we understand what acceptable risk is, right? Security is not about removing risk because we can't do that. We have to mitigate the risk. We have to allow certain risk because our employees need access to data. We trust our employees with that data at some level, and we need to give them access so that they can be productive. Adding all of these pieces, whether it's MFA, a strong identity through IAM, orchestration, SOAR, responding to events, analytics to track what's going on and look for those anomalies, and encryption and scoring of data as well, can help manage all of that. Big piece here is that we're looking at protecting the data. We're less concerned about protecting the network or protecting the device, although we're still doing all of that. The end goal is to protect that data. We still use micro-segmentation and next-generation firewalls so that we take those corporate crown jewels, and those sit inside a very secure location. There's still access from outside. We still use the same control plane, that is our identity, to access those, and we drive towards continuous authentication. Right now, when we authenticate, it's a one-time deal. We get a token, or we get authenticated. We get a session running with an application, and we just go off, and that runs essentially forever, right? I log on to Netflix, and I watch TV all night long. I don't have to redo it. But what we want to do is get to a point where we're doing continuous authentication, because I can start working at something in one location and pick up that machine and move to another location, and maybe that's not a place where you want me doing that. So every request should be authenticated. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. Microsoft is just announcing that they're doing work to allow tokens to be expired when a user's password is changed or a user's account is disabled, so that users immediately lose access to any data that they shouldn't have access to if we've disabled their account or changed the password or acquired MFA or any of those things. It's a work in progress. We're not there yet, but we're going along. Every request should be authenticated, and we do that in various ways. SSL communications using bindings authenticate every request to make sure that there isn't a man-in-the-middle attack. Encrypted machine authenticators allow us to authenticate at each access. A user location, I'm not as big a fan of user location. Again, as we said earlier, I think you approach that everyone is the same, whether they're inside or outside the network, that doesn't matter. You may make some exceptions for places you don't do business and simply not accept connections from there. Of course, we want to balance security and usability, and we do that through managing the user sign-on authentication frequency and multiple layers of authentication. So Microsoft CISO would like to see us all performing MFA at every authentication. Well, that sounds onerous, but it's not if you use the right tools, whether that's FIDO, Windows Hello, or whatever, where users actually are performing multi-factor authentication without actually realizing it and not having to respond to a phone call or something like that. And this is how I remember it. Ronald Reagan always said, trust but verify. Ours is don't trust, but do verify. So how do we verify? Well, if it's a user authentication, MFA is kind of the default path. We can also use FIDO 2, which works with certificates for user authentication. But MFA is really the way we improve that authentication, because we don't trust that password. Right? That's the zero trust. We don't trust the password anymore. The user can give that password away. They can leak it accidentally. Someone can discover it. All those things. So we add MFA on top of it. Microsoft says this prevents 99% of attacks through phishing and those types of things. So MFA is very critical. We also have to authenticate machines, and we want to validate those regularly. And so whether a machine is managed, has proper certificates on it, located in a TPM, so they're securely protected. Sessions, we talked a little bit about binding the SSL TLS session. And passwordless, easy for me to say, passwordless authentication, moving on to not just users using the authenticator or some other method, but we also worry about service accounts that have passwords. On premises, we can move to group managed service accounts, which do not contain passwords. And in the cloud, we can also use managed identities, which do not use passwords. Much more secure, can't be phished, can't be shared, all of those items. So the objectives here, right? Frank said, assume breach, never trust, always verify. Remember Ronnie Reagan. And refine the mindset of a secure physical network, right? You may have a secure physical network, but most users should not reside on that. The idea of a corp net that everything's loaded on and anybody can get from one thing to the next. We're seeing a lot of people do internet first authentication, where we authenticate out to an STS in the cloud, and then hairpin back if we need something on premises, because most of our services are already in the cloud, and I may be working from outside the organization, so forcing me back into the network only doubles my network traffic, makes all of my work harder. And if we move the control plane out to the cloud, then we have that access from anywhere in the world, right? Remember, treat all users as external, so there's no inside out. You get better use if you're in the corp net or out. You're just all the same. And subject them to the same identity and security checks that you would for each of these users as continuously as possible, because those things can change, right? So last things here, we want to understand the risk. And how do we do that? We take a look at what's acceptable risk. And that requires that we know the health of your environment, right? So what is the state of your devices? Who are your users? How do they work? Employees, contractors, vendors, business partners, whatever it might be, clinicians who don't work for you, right? Where are all these people who work in your organization? How do they access resources? Of course, we have to have endpoint management. You can't trust devices unless you are able to say they're up to date, they've got antivirus, they're good to go. If you can't manage the device, and we see that some in clinical settings, people don't want their devices managed, we can use application management, which allows us to only control the use of the application, but not control the entire device. We need continuous monitoring, and Cloud Access Security Broker, or CASB, gives us some of that, but also gives us the ability to manage where our data is stored in the cloud, be that Box, Dropbox, SharePoint, Salesforce, wherever it is. A CASB allows us to tell those vendors how to treat our data, and they'll respect that. And we get feedback on how that is being used and how that data is being protected. I guess it would be those data being protected. And then, of course, you want to monitor sign-in activity, right? That's an important piece. Frank will talk more about that. Azure does some really good pieces in that. And if you're not using that, you do some things for your SIM so you're able to trust that. So what is acceptable risk, right? What's the risk model and priorities? The right tools. So understand where you're using your data and understand where those assets are that you need to protect and how you're protecting them. As Frank said, identify your protect surface. And once that's identified, then you can create those policies and enforce them to make sure that anyone who's accessing that data does it correctly. And then this may cause some other areas of the infrastructure network to be more vulnerable. So this is an iterative process. We have to come back around to it and verify that we're still doing the right thing. So I'm going to hand it back to Frank now to talk about user and device identities. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. So we'll talk specifically now on some of the things that you'll want to do when starting your zero trust journey, or continuing down that path, and really where your focus should lie. And we start with identities and how to create strong user and device identities, because as we discussed before, identity becomes really central to the zero trust model. And so we see here, I mean, we have a picture of this icon is traditionally used, the one in the center there, traditionally used for Azure AD, but Azure AD is just one type of a service that can be used. I know there's several others out there that serve a similar purpose, but the idea is that you really want to focus your identity and access management on one single control plane. And your key objectives are going to be to ensure that you've established a single digital identity for each individual and device in your organization. Really trying to limit the number of identities that users are using across multiple applications, which again goes to a strong single sign-on strategy and identity and access management, provisioning and deprovisioning process. That IAM system, the Identity and Access Management System, is there. It's going to add that layer of protection that ensures consistent application of access rules and policies. So again, very important that from birthright, from when that user is first onboarded into your organization, that you have a process that is repeatable, that can be audited, and that also works in reverse, right? When you deprovision users, that they're being removed from the environment as quickly as possible, and that their access is being revoked across those applications. The other points on having an IAM solution, of course, is that it reduces the complexity and costs and protects those user credentials. There is, of course, an initial upfront cost, but once you have it established, it can really aid in reducing overall cost of the lifecycle management of those identities. And then it really empowers users to be productive from anywhere, which is really a goal, to remove that friction, allow users to work from any device, again, provided that the device is managed in some way, whether directly managed through mobile device management policies or through application management policies, but it really allows that flexibility and a good user experience. Some use cases for identity access management, of course, with Microsoft Azure Active Directory, it has the ability to integrate with your on-premise existing environment with Active Directory and Azure Active Directory Connect, synchronizing those identities into the cloud. There's also Azure B2B, which allows for guest access into your environment, but still gives you the ability to control access to those guest accounts because you're still leveraging the same single control plane or security plane in the environment, which is Azure AD. There's also the ability to federate with other identity providers where need be. So there might be partners that are using other providers, but Azure AD provides that federation capability. And then, of course, all of the SaaS applications that are out there where Azure AD can provide the access and authorization or the authentication authorization controls to those applications. Of course, Office 365 being a first-party application, but then just look at the Microsoft Gallery, 4,000 applications plus many more that can be configured for single sign-on through various mechanisms. Another area to focus on as far as identities is concerned is privileged identities or dynamic roles. This again is just the ability to discover, restrict, and monitor those privileged identities, and Microsoft has a service in privileged identity management or under identity governance solution to do that. You're able to enforce that on-demand, just-in-time administration. So I may be someone who works in the IT organization, and I may need exchange administrator rights or global administrator rights at certain points to perform my job duties, but I don't have an account that has full-time access with that role. I need to request privilege escalation. That request can go through a workflow process where my manager may need to approve that. Or if not, at least it is something that's been recorded that I did elevate my privileges. And once I am done with that task, that identity returns back to a non-privileged state. And it's not, that works for cloud, but of course we can't neglect the on-premise and the hybrid. There are solutions around providing privileged access management around on-premise accounts as well. Another important aspect of creating strong identities is eliminating passwords. Really starting to look at ways that you can eliminate passwords in the environment. One way to do that is start with just modernizing your existing password policies. Many organizations are still using the password policies that have been in place since around 2003. That's when NIST first advised through their publications on the concept that we still use today of having users create passwords that have complexity requirements in them. They have to rotate those passwords every 30, 60, 90 days. These are policies that they've come to realize really did not help, and in fact, added to more breaches or added to more risk in the environment. The quote there at the bottom of the slide, much of what I did, I now regret. It's Bill Burr. If you know the comedian Bill Burr, it's not the comedian Bill Burr, it's just a gentleman who worked for the Army at the time and was tasked with putting together those requirements back in 2003 for things like password complexity, password rotation, because they needed to have some standard around passwords, and one did not exist at the time. And so he came up with those ideas, and that's what went into those papers. But 2 years ago, they sort of reversed course and realized after much research and analysis that instead of following those guidelines, better to have minimum password requirements of at least 8 characters, no complexity. Do not force your users to change those passwords, because users just get into this habit of using similar patterns, you know, like spring 2020 to summer 2020 to fall 2020, et cetera, that threat actors have a really easy time of guessing and using as part of data breaches. Instead, really start looking into the use of biometrics, the what you are aspect of multi-factor authentication. So that could be Touch ID, could be face unlock, fingerprint, which is now supported on a lot of hardware. And above all else, if you have to keep your password policies in place right now, it cannot go completely passwordless. Enable modern authentication and MFA in your environments. Mark mentioned it, the statistic that 99% of breaches can be prevented if MFA was enabled, and that's just a true statement. Can't get around that. Enable MFA in your environments. The path to passwordless, to complete passwordless, of course, is develop and deploy those password replacement offerings. So things like Windows Hello for Business, Windows 10, and Microsoft Authenticator can be used for that. Reduce the user visible password surface area. And then transition users to strong authentication instead of passwords. So again, there's Windows Hello for Business is one of those things that can do that, can help users to move to a passwordless posture, where now it's just either hardware security token like YubiKeys or FIDO2 keys that can be made available, or built-in TPM chips on a lot of modern devices that can store encrypted credentials and provide them to the relying party for access. And then eventually being able to eliminate passwords from the identity store itself, so that the passwords do not exist in the identity store. They've gone to this modern approach of a passwordless authentication and authorization mechanism using modern authentication protocols. Certificate authentication, also very useful still. I mean, it's been around for a while and used in a lot of environments, but something that sometimes gets neglected, at least from what I see. But you can use certificates to authenticate using for non-person accounts, or accounts that are, again, IoT devices, service accounts that are being leveraged by those IoT devices and other applications. Go a long way into helping eliminate those passwords. There's group managed service accounts, MSAs, have been part of Windows Server operating system for some time. But again, a lot of applications support them, but they're not used. A good way to, again, eliminate password management. In this case, it's at least password management from the environment, because there's still technically a password, but Active Directory would handle rotation of those passwords and updates of those passwords. Of course, those passwords are just randomly generated characters that are very long and very hard for an attacker who's just looking for the low-hanging fruit to compromise and exploit. Using SSH sessions for your Linux security sessions or authentication sessions as opposed to a password. And of course, managing your identities in Azure, or again in that single control plane as your identity provider, but also as your security kind of decision maker as to when policies are enforced. Model authentication, adopting this throughout the organization, throughout the enterprise, very important. You know, legacy protocols, POP, IMAP, MAPI, SMTP, these types of protocols are not able to enforce MFA, which makes them preferred entry points for attackers. Now that is changing. There are, the past month, there have been some enhancements to these protocols, to IMAP in particular I saw, where they can support model authentication, but really at this point, there's just a lot better ways of doing it. You know, and there are service accounts, or let's say for organizations that do, you know, marketing and mass mailing, where they use, you know, SMTP authentication, or even for your multifunction devices in the enterprise, which are connected via an SMTP authentication request. They are moving to make those modern authentication capable, but even so, whenever possible, try to eliminate those protocols from the environment. Those that have done so, they see a reduction in compromise by 67%. And again, just want to emphasize that single factor authentication, that simple credential pair of username and password is not enough in this in the time that we're living now with the advanced threats that are out there. OpenID Connect is one of those protocols. It's part of the model authentication that helps in doing so, because instead, again, of using a password, the flow really is about an exchange of tokens by the user to an identity provider, and an identity provider to a relying party, a service provider, that basically is saying, yes, this person can be trusted, but they say who they say they are, because they provided me with the correct credentials. And again, those can be beyond just username and password. It could still be a password, but it's because they also provided stepped up authentication into the environment. And now they've been allowed access to that application. So really try to look for applications that are supporting these modern protocols, authentication protocols and authorization protocols like OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, which builds in the OAuth authentication flow and authorization flow into its model. Biometrics, again, 502. So we touched on this, but again, start implementing in the environment. You know, Windows Hello for Business. A lot of organizations are still Microsoft based, at least at the desktop and endpoint, and they can start leveraging things like Windows Hello for Business as well. So we're going to run through these last few slides. We're getting up to the top of the hour here. I'm just going to build this out. So Microsoft approach, again, is basically leveraged around that zero trust, around that security policy engine, which is Azure AD and all of its components around conditional access, identity protection, and you can even add, you know, information protection for data classification and enforcement of an encryption of data at rest, and also while it's in transit. Basically, on the left-hand side, you have that signal. So things like the user risks are being evaluated. That they provide stepped-up authentication. Is this an impossible travel scenario where the user logged in from Newark, New Jersey, and then 5 minutes later they're in Beijing, China? So decisions can be made around that. Is it now an unusual location? where the user was at one IP address and now they've changed and they're logging in from the local coffee shop. That is another signal that can be evaluated. Same thing for the device risk. Is it managed? Is it compliant? Has this device been jailbroken or rooted? These are things that mobile device management tools can help in making those decisions. But ultimately, all those signals are going to that central security engine where the policies are evaluated, and then in the Microsoft ecosystem, that's where the enforcement comes in. So, it's a modern app and protocol like Office 365. There could be, sensitivity labels that are applied to data assets. The CASB, Cloud App Security is again another solution that's able to determine, does the user have permission to access this document, to download this document from a SharePoint library onto their device, and so on. And we added this slide, do I own this already? Because many organizations do not realize that they may already have a lot of these tools at their disposal. So if you own everything on the left-hand side, you have Office 365. There are a number of things you can do today with just Office 365 licensing, like an E3, E5 license in your environment. In the middle, those components all comprise the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, and then of course there's Windows 10, and all three together make up what's now the Microsoft 365 stack. So, organizations we find tend to have the licensing in place either around Microsoft 365, which is all three of those things, or bits and pieces of each, but there's still things you can do. So, for instance, if you're just an Office 365 customer and you have E1, E3, E5, or F3 now, it's not F1 anymore, it changed just as we were putting this together, you have the ability to do single sign-on. And I had an asterisk there. The asterisk is there because at the time, and this is just a few weeks ago, it was still limited to 10 applications that can be used for single sign-on for users. But at the end of April, Microsoft announced that they've made single sign-on available for free as long as you own a commercial cloud product, like one of these licensing SKUs here, or Dynamics, or the Power Automate stack. Any of those can be used for single sign-on, so that all your applications authentication can occur through that single control plane through Azure AD. If you own EMS E3 or Microsoft 365 E3, you have access to things like the application proxy, which is able to take your legacy on-prem applications and host them through Azure AD. You have conditional access, access to conditional access and setting up those policies. You can integrate MCAS into Office 365. And then there's the on-premise end user behavioral analytics, which is ATA, Advanced Threat Analytics, that you can deploy into your environment to give you insight into threats on-prem in Active Directory. And then the EMS E5 SKU, or the Microsoft 365 SKU, adds on top of that with things like identity protection, which is helps evaluate user risk, identity governance, which is that PIM piece we talked about, the dynamic roles, and then cloud-based end user behavior analytics with Azure ATP, and then full use of MCAS, which is you're able to tie into third-party cloud products like AWS and Google Cloud, G Suite, Box, Dropbox, and to name a few others. This is a little repetitive, but it just builds out a little bit more, showing how in the Microsoft world how things works. Again, we talked about those signals, and these are all the different products that help either generate those signals or are evaluating those signals. And again, everything revolves around that single control plane, which is Azure AD. So we went over a bit, but for those that are still here, we do have time for questions, if there are any.
There are actually a couple of questions, Frank. Let me read them off to you. There's there's a number of them. someone posted MFA can also be hacked. There are a number of ways MFA can be hacked, but that's a proper system will help protect you against that. We certainly talk about that, but that doesn't clear things up.
Yeah.
So when you say an individual should have one digital identity, how does that tie in with admin accounts? How would user and admin accounts be separate for an individual in this case?
So I would say, well, there's two approaches, and sometimes it becomes a little bit of a religious argument, but if you're using something like a privileged access management or privileged identity management solution, you could technically follow that guidance and have a single strong identity for that user. And that user could be set up to elevate those privileges to a privileged role. But again, that would have to go through some type of workflow process and enforcement process in order for them to elevate those privileges. And then once they are complete doing what they need to do with that elevated role, they would go back to being a single a user with no privileges in the environment. So you could follow that guidance, and that would hold true. Of course, a lot of organizations still like to have separate admin accounts, and I think that's still a good idea to do that. But I would even then still make sure that even that account is still not a full-time admin, but is eligible to be an admin type account. And Mark, I don't know if you feel differently about that, but that would be my approach to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right approach. We see that across the board with upgrading entitlements for users in an application, and then downgrading those entitlements, those permissions to an application, which speaks to another question that we had, which is given that Microsoft's not the identity management solution of choice, well, I guess that's up for argument. What would be the recommendation for a Microsoft shop with regard to identity management lifecycle, off-source provisioning, permissions, etc.? Well, at Oxford, we partner with Savient that does a lot of work in governance and this very much entitlement management that I was just speaking of. And they're a partner of Microsoft, and we partner with both of them as well. So that's where we've gone in doing work with governance, which is really what you're talking about here. Microsoft is also building governance tools into Azure, but they're not as fine-grained for SaaS applications, I would say, at this point. Frank, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, there are, there's still plenty of other good third-party solutions out there that can integrate, of course, but we, having been Microsoft partners for some time, have used, of course, MIM, but now shifting to, more cloud-based solutions.
Okay. Does Zero Trust have a recommendation for anonymizing PI data? This includes any PI data that links to a natural person. And I really don't think Zero Trust speaks to PII at all, really, except for securing data, does it?
No, I mean, because again, it's not a product and it's a framework, right? So we're not really talking about anonymizing that data. I mean, there are tools and services, for instance, a CASB, a good CASB can anonymize data for the users that are accessing applications in an enterprise where that's needed. But as a security model or framework itself, it's really not addressing, protecting or anonymizing PII data.
All right. And how about automated accounts provisioning Zero Trust model? For instance, Workday to Azure AD, Connector, and SCIM.
Well, it speaks to that, creating that single strong identity, and Microsoft has the ability now with several cloud HR solutions like Workday, like SuccessFactors, to be able to do provisioning from the cloud directly into Active Directory, and then Active Directory, of course, can continue to be synced with Azure AD Connect. That identity is provisioned into Azure AD. And then, of course, with SCIM, there's, Azure AD is able to do outbound provisioning using SCIM to many, applications, some of the bigger ones, ServiceNow, Salesforce, to name just a couple, that again can help with automating that the identity lifecycle management.
Okay, and are there a list of use cases that is used in SIM with respect to zero trust? And I would think that is just that the SIM is going to be the place you collect notifications, particularly you collect signal and you bubble up notifications. So kind of everything plugs into SIM from where I sit. What do you think, Frank?
Yeah, so on the Microsoft side, now we have Azure Sentinel, and Sentinel, fits right into the security stack, into the ecosystem, was able to receive all those signals from the various service providers that are plugged in, so that you're able to do more of that security orchestration and automation, and respond more quickly to threats in the environment. But I mean, I can't think of a specific use case around it, but it's really about being able to better hunting, better finding, and correlating of events in an environment, which is part of the zero trust, overall the zero trust model, in making sure that you have good signals and that you're really weeding it down to what's most important and not just a bunch of noise.
All right, and the last question, just to finish it up, did you have a link for the licensing changes for SSO? Or just take a search on
yeah, I mean, we published a blog last week on it.
Just take a look on our website. You should be able to find it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Frank. I'm done.
Okay. Very good. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.
Thank you.